During the presentation, I'm going to be calling out a lot of resources. You can find all of these resources on my website if you can remember how to spell my name. It's not Welsh, it is Italian, but it can be challenging for some. When I talk about downloadable PDFs or resources, you can find them under lessons. I'm going to be talking a lot about the creative process today. So many of the resources are here under creativity. In the second session, when I'm talking about game changers, things that change the way you think about making photographs and what you could do with photographs, you could look under technique. You'll see a lot of resources like this. There are basically several books worth of information on my website, and this is just starting. David and I were talking about the almost 50 conversations with other photographers that are on my website as well. It's a very information-rich resource. You'll notice that some of these are free to members. To become a member, you sign up for my free newsletter. That will give you the username and password that will allow you to get those free resources. There are new resources that come online every month, and the newsletter lets you know where those new resources and what they are, as well as opportunities like workshops or the releases of new books or exhibits that I think you might be enjoying seeing, or free seminars around the country, etc. So the newsletter will let you know what's new and what's going on there, as well as the blog. That's the homepage on the workshops, as well as the blog, which doesn't have today's queued up because it posted after I left my hotel room this morning. Today's post was on how many thoughts in a day do we have on average. Any guess? I'm not sure exactly how they do this scientifically, but they've done a lot of social science there, and they've come up with this average number of how many thoughts a day do you think we think?
319.
You're very zen, my friend. Apparently the average number is 60,000. It was funny, I asked my folks in the studio recently, so I don't know, 1 million? It's like, wait a minute, there aren't that many seconds in a day. Can you really think six thoughts in a second? So I guess a few people could, but I certainly can't. At any rate, an interesting question to ask, how many of them are significant, and more importantly, is that something that just happens, or is the thought process something that you guide, something that you become perhaps creative with? And that's part of what I want to address in the first session, process. Before I go there, as a visual introduction, I just thought I'd show you a few images so that you do have some sense of who it is you're talking to. I'm primarily a landscape or nature photographer, and I like oceans and deserts particularly. I go to fabulous places like Namibia. This is one of the more sublime moments I got to have in a helicopter above these 1,500-foot high sand dunes. For me, being in nature and inspired by nature is extremely important. I find it intellectually fascinating. The science behind it is fascinating. I find it socially interesting. How do we orient ourselves in our world, in the universe, in relationship to nature? And I find it spiritually very fulfilling. I would define spiritual as not something that is necessarily religious or denominational, but something that's holistic, something that's both physical, mental, and emotional. And I think we all have spiritual natures, but we may have different orientations to that spirituality, different ways of interacting with that. I think in some degree, when you use the word spiritual, people are often talking about what seems to be most important, perhaps valuable or durable. And so there are a lot of interesting notions about what's valuable, what's most important, other kinds of things. It's clear when you look at my work that we're no longer in Kansas anymore. This isn't your father's photography. It's certainly not my father's photography. It's not straight photography. And I know a lot of, well, actually, when I got started with Photoshop, version 1, I started doing things that I was doing in painting, compositing images, making images that were clear in my mind's eye so that I could share them with other people, bringing the inside out. It was interesting to hear a lot of reactions. Well, you can't do that. And I would say things like, well, I just did. But that's cheating. And my response was always, well, whose game are you playing? I remember a lot of scenarios, but one that was very important for me was when Dad was teaching out at the Ansel Adams workshops. Jerry Ullsman was also teaching that week, and we were at the dinner table, and they were having this discussion about pre-visualization. Dad starts in with Ansel, well, if you can pre-visualize your images, you deserve what you get. And Ansel made the mistake of taking Dad seriously. I mean, Dad was teasing, and he had a point to make. The point was that along the way, there's a process of discovery. Ansel starts backpedaling and says, well, when I coined the term pre-visualization, I didn't mean I knew exactly what I was going to get when I clicked the shutter. I meant that I was in control of my materials enough to get where I wanted to go. But there's still a process of exploration. After all, I coined the phrase, the negative is the score and the print is the performance. And I'm looking at Jerry Ullsman and I'm thinking, this whole pre-visualization discussion does not apply to this black and white surrealist who uses 8 enlargers. Same cameras, same film, same enlargers, just more of them, creating these surreal composites. And I thought his work was so different and very interesting, even to the point where when I first picked up the camera seriously for my own uses, a professional photographer asked me, well, who are your influences? You could tell he was Irish, right? So, well, William Blake. No, I mean photographers. So, Jerry Ullsman. No, pick another. He doesn't count. Can you imagine saying that in this day and age? And actually, I strongly encourage you guys to see, if you haven't seen it, the show that's up at the Met right now, Faking It Before Photoshop. It's a fantastic show. I was telling David, I haven't gone through an exhibit that slowly in a very long time. It's a first-rate show. A little bit of a gimmicky title. The show is anything but. It's a really solid show. At any rate, almost on cue, during this conversation between Dad and Ansel, pre-visualization, Jerry cues and says, that term pre-visualization, it's just such a mouthful. I never would have used the word post-visualization for what I do if you hadn't come up with this pre-visualization stuff. It's true, we do kind of stand on the shoulders of giants. And this is not just an inheritance of technique, it's an inheritance of ideas and thoughts. It's also an inheritance of patterns of thinking, right? And we can choose from that. We don't have to just go with the flow. We can chart our own courses amid all of this. I went to school, studied painting, literature. It really wasn't until I graduated from college and Photoshop came around that I decided to use photography as my primary medium. I still wanted to create images that were before my mind's eye and make those clear. And it's been a continual process of discovery. What I'm going to show you is, first, many of the processes that go on behind the scenes, so to speak, how many of these images were created. And if you only took one thing away from the next 40 minutes, this session, my advice to you would be to just simply be aware of your process. Watch it. You'll learn a lot just by watching the way you do things, the way you think about things, the way you feel about things, or rather, I should say, the ways you do things, the ways you think, the ways you feel. And they're all interconnected. With more awareness, you have more options. And with more choices, you may ultimately make better choices. Better for what? Better for you, and that requires a little bit of clarity of why are you in this? Why are you trying to do what you're doing? I find a lot of times in the workshops that I teach, many of the people who have been at it for quite some time and have quite a high degree of skill haven't asked the question, well, why do I ultimately want to do this? They end up playing somebody else's game. And for whatever reason, looking at me as a mentor, somebody with some experience, they're willing to listen to me saying, give yourself permission to do whatever you need to do in whatever way you need to do it to find out what's most valuable for you. It's a very permissive statement. It also takes a certain amount of responsibility and a certain amount of follow-through on that. With all of these options, when you really get down to it, like, why am I making the photographs I make? What do they mean? What do I want to do with them? Why do I feel these are more interesting than others? What's better? How do I up my game? How do I pursue excellence? Is it excellence in reference to what's already been established outside? Let's do it like Ansel Adams. Well, you know, as my good friend Keith Carter says, the world doesn't need another Ansel Adams. We already had one of those. Right? What the world needs is you. You're a very unique individual at an extraordinarily interesting moment in time with new opportunities and new possibilities. And I'm not just talking about software, though I'm including that in the mix. This is a really interesting time. If you can find your own personal clarity amid this, it will help guide you into depth, greatness. But your greatness is going to be different than somebody else's greatness. And you need to go through a process of discovery in order to find these things out. And a lot of times it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a long period of time. And many people wonder, well, will I ever get there? Will I find my personal voice? Will I ever finally figure it all out? I don't think any of us will ever figure it all out. But we figure more out along the way. And what's interesting is when I go through portfolio reviews with people, most of the time we find that they're already there. I remember a good friend of mine, an alum from years back, coming up to me and asking me, well, do you think I could be a photographer? As we were looking at her contact sheets. And I said, well, what are these? Well, these are my photographs. You know, so are you a photographer? So the question was, how could she become a better photographer? Right? Just by simply acknowledging, here are your photographs, yes, you are a photographer. Now, what kind of photographer? I know I'm doing a long preamble here, but this is a really important question. I think photographers are laboring with too limited a language, put it that way. We have this one big word, photography, that's supposed to encompass all types of photography. Jerry Ullsman's surrealism, Ansel Adams' almost straight work, James Nachtwey's documentary war photography, Ragelander's evocations of paintings, Man Ray's design statements. If you don't know any of these photographers, or some of these photographers, Google them, you're in for a visual treat. Part of it is, I think, looking out there what the possibilities are. But how are we to reconcile, you know, the question, is it photography? It's not really a useful question if it involves recording something with light, even if it's Adam Foos's, one of our locals, Adam Foos's photograms, where there is no camera. There's just light-sensitive material. It's still a light drawing, but it's a very different kind of photograph. So I think the question, not is it photography, but what kind of photography is it, is really important. And now the follow-up question is, what kind of photography is your photography? What kind of photography is most meaningful or relevant for you? I think photographers would do well to borrow a lot of the terms from literary theory. Can you imagine writers saying, well, it's writing? Well, is it journalism? Is it poetry? Is it a screenplay? Is it epic or lyric? Is it short form, long form? They know the difference instantly between the fiction and the nonfiction sections. We're not as clear about that in photography, in part because of lack of language, which often leads to pointing out that we've got a kind of a lack of clarity in concepts. For our own selves, I think it's helpful to think about the language we use. And as I was saying, watch your process. Watch the way you describe things. Watch the way you think about things. Continue that process. What I would say is, don't watch with a critical eye. Don't be judgmental. Simply be observant. It's a more meditative approach. Just say, what have we got here? What's happening? Not, well, it should be better, or it should be this, or I expect this outcome. Just watch with greater awareness. Later, you can make the decision to do something or not to do something, to decide you want to go down a road or not, to see that you're responding one way and not another. All of those kinds of follow-ups can be useful. But if you start judging and criticizing, you're going to shut down the process too quickly, much like brainstorming. This is a book I put together. This all came out of, this came out of Lifetime, actually. I'm often asked, how long does it take me to make one of the surreal composites that I've showed you? And I've said, well, anywhere from 15 minutes to 6 months. It's variable. We don't always know. Sometimes we run into roadblocks. Other times it happens much faster than we expected. And I was talking earlier with David about how sometimes, well, many times, people equate difficult with better. The harder you work, the longer you work, the better it must be. Well, not necessarily. I can't tell you how many canvases I've ruined by overworking them. Right? And there is a point at which you want to stop before you lose the spontaneity and the freshness. It's one of the things I think is so terrific about photography, that you have to be in the moment. And some of these very ephemeral things happen for just a fraction of a second. You have to be there, and you have to be aware, prepared enough to be able to seize some part of that. Right? So harder is not necessarily better. At any rate, how long did it really take me to get here? I'm saying 47 years and counting. Because I started drawing before I could talk, and I grew up, as David said, in an artistic family, and I'm still going. And it's not finished, but it has been brought to a certain level of completeness. I don't want to say completion as if it's over, but complete enough to be able to do something like create a book, or to be able to create a slideshow, or make blog posts, or do something with it. And I'll come back to why I think it's important to take on projects. They actually generate more creativity, more results. When you find the right container, you'll find that you're far more productive. So, one of the first things that I started doing was drawing. I remember my parents, you know those stories that parents love to embarrass you with? This was one. We moved to Ireland. Dad had just gotten a Guggenheim grant. He decided to photograph the megalithic monuments in the British Isles. We rented an apartment in Dublin so that he could go out into the Irish landscape and photograph these stones, and we'd be somewhat close by for the year. I took up mural making. I took my crayons to the walls and almost got us kicked out. And I had terrific parents. They got big blocks of paper and they put them on the walls in every room and said, "Hey kid, here, on the paper, not on the walls." And we got to keep the apartment. Right? But what terrific parents, right? To be able to provide an outlet and to encourage. A fairly simple solution, but so permissive. And we were always very respectful in my family of each other's creative lives, to create a vehicle for that. So drawing was something that was extremely important. I went to school and pursued this. I've drawn all my life. And it was interesting, as I was in senior year in high school, you're always asking these questions. What do you want to do with your life, young man? Which college will you select? What do you want to study? All those kinds of things. And it was a real toss-up for me between marine biology and something in the arts. And I did a lot of soul searching, and I thought, you know, it's interesting. This is one thing, drawing, that you've done all your life that you hadn't been putting on the table. Maybe you ought to look at that. Just look at what you're actually doing, because more often than not, you're doing that more than anything else. Mom said that if I got one more aquarium, she would lock the doors and fill my room up with water. So, and it's actually probably pretty good that I didn't go to the University of Santa Cruz first. I went there after I went to Yale, because that's when I picked up scuba diving and got exposed to the fantastic kelp fields with the whales and the otters and the sharks and all that fabulous stuff down there, because it might have drawn me back in. It took me a while to learn how to draw this way. And I think that's one of the really interesting things. Photography comes so quickly. But it's interesting that in drawing, the personal sensibility, the sense of gesture, the sense of proportion, this sense of self comes much more quickly, even in the drawings of children. Now, to learn how to draw more photorealistically takes quite a lot of time to develop the eye-hand coordination. To focus a camera takes very little time. But to focus the vision and to refine the sensibility so that it seems different than others, seems more your own, that often comes much more, it's much more challenging to define that, much more challenging to refine that. In fact, the question often gets put to the side. So my point here is, while I've learned to draw this way, I rarely draw this way now because of time. This took me 20 some odd hours. This took me 10 hours. This took me 1 hour. More often than not, I'm sketching like this, sometimes on my iPad, just to sketch out ideas about future compositions or to work things out compositionally. I'll show you more possibilities. So we might think that this is a, quote, better drawing. Perhaps as a drawing in and of itself, that might be true. But this is a very useful type of drawing, a different kind of drawing used for a different purpose, to explore and record ideas It's unfinished, but it's very useful and it's highly practical. It's interesting for me when I go out and lecture about creativity and I ask a room, how many of you draw? How many of you can draw? You want to do it today? How many of you guys can draw? Okay, if I say how many of you guys can sketch? Any more hands? Doodle. How many of you guys can doodle? Okay, more hands go up, right? Interesting to note that when you talk to elementary school kids, sometime after 8, if you get to the kids 8 and under, and you ask them how many can draw, 90 or 100% of the hands go up. And I remember this wonderful story in Ted Orland and David Bale's Art and Fear book, which is a great read. They relate a story of one of their colleagues talking to his daughter as he's driving her home after school. And she's asking, "Hey, Dad, what'd you do at work today?" "Well, I taught my students how to draw." "When did they forget?" It's very interesting to ask ourselves, how quickly do we jump to finished results? Why do we always value the finished results? And could we also look to the unfinished parts of the process that lead to those finished results? A lot of times we try and finish an image in 125th of a second without doing any kind of reflection, intellectual or emotional, or really thinking it through. And it often doesn't show readily because it looks good. Ansel Adams said there's nothing worse than a sharp picture of a fuzzy concept. And I totally agree with him. I think it's one of the best things he ever said. So I challenge you to think more about the content and less about acutance or pixel peeping in any form. Think a lot more about what you're putting into the image. One of my students years ago asked a fantastic question. Okay, so you got the picture, but did you show up? Really show up? And if you showed up, what did you bring to the picture? It's a very interesting set of questions. It may be that we're guilty of making a lot of well-crafted nothings. I think there's a lot of that in the world of photography. One of the reasons I draw is because I can put together things that I couldn't do easily before Photoshop. This is all BP for me before Photoshop. And I would just sketch out different ideas. Now I'm still doing that in rougher form, looking at different possible combinations, possible ideas, and I've got file cabinets full of sketches, lots of grist for the mill. Some are working a single idea out, others are finding a lot of ideas. And that's one of the things that I would recommend that you think about when you doodle. So this is one way I'll work a scene. Say the first time that I went to Antarctica, and I'm thinking about how will I catch these different pieces. I realized that Ansel was trying to finish the photograph largely in camera and then enhance it in the print, where Jerry Ullsman was looking at separate pieces. Ansel had an idea of the final composition. Maybe he'd crop it a little bit, maybe he'd alter it slightly through contrast or darkening and lightening, but it was largely set. Where Jerry's pieces he would be photographing and had no idea how they would fall together. Might take a year, might take 10 years, might take a lifetime before it all came together. And he didn't always know how the pieces were used, so he's shooting differently. When I survey something like this, I quickly activate the writer in me and I say, so what have I got? What are the nouns? I've got a moon, I've got clouds, I've got a mountain, I've got icebergs, I've got the horizon line, and I can put together a whole bunch of different combinations of these. This is just the iconic things thrown in the center of the picture, very obvious, direct way of just sort of cataloging what are the pieces. Now, how many ways can I put those together? This is one I'm still looking for. I need to find a windless day in Antarctica on the windiest continent. That's pretty challenging. Or I need to change my game and make a composite and create the reflection. But that's going to create a different kind of image. Right? It's not better or worse, it's just different. I might have to either composite or make a long exposure, stay on shore for a long time. Relationships between numbers of things. How many things can I put together in different combinations that suggest relationships? Maybe relationships of isolation or of creating spaces to hold things in. One of the things that I find is that not only do I come up with a lot of ideas that I might later create, but I also sensitize myself to a number of patterns, and by actually physically drawing the patterns out, I'm more likely to remember them. There's a fantastic book out there called Brain Rules. John Medina's book, Brain Rules, is a fantastic book on neuroscience that's totally approachable for the everyday reader. And he has some very interesting things to say about education and about how we learn. Some of the statistics that he shares are very relevant. He says, if you write something down, you're 73% more likely to take action on it. And it's almost the same percentage as 72% more likely to remember it. So when I start these sessions, I often say, please take notes. Actually turn on your cell phones, just mute them. Because if you want to take a snap, or you're actually taking a text note, or you're enhancing it with a drawing, you might want to draw on something, great, go for it. There's a number of ways of taking those notes. There's something about actually doing things physically that helps us understand them more. And I've often been thinking a lot about the difference between drawing something, knowing it by hand over a longer period of time, and seeing things very quickly, instantaneously. And it's not better or worse, it's just different. It brings something different to the game. And that's why I'm encouraging you to look at your process and see what happens when you change the game. These are some of the photographs that I found. What I found on that first trip was that when I got back, where usually 20% of my stuff is, quote, straight or editorial, 80% of the work that I had done on this first trip was more directly representational like that, more editorial. And yet it still fit with my voice and the types of things that I wanted to say with my images. So I decided to play that more straight game. I decided to shift my game. A lot of people said, hey, you're getting back to your roots. Where really, my roots were drawing before that. And I flipped in and out between learning straight photography from my father, learning painting from my mother, working with both hand in hand all along the way. I guess it's really useful just to ask yourself, what's your game? And it might change over time. It's useful not necessarily to know before you click the shutter, but at some point to figure out where you want to go with your images. Let me see if I can show you that really quickly. I just want to show you one way. And I want to make one distinction in terms of this kind of drawing. You'll notice that all of these, sorry guys, all of these compositions, it's the same mountain, iceberg, and cloud. It's because I've drawn them all into this one document. And notice also that it's not the specific cloud or the specific half moon. It's just a generic icon for these are the types of elements that I'll be recombining and that I'll be encountering again and again and again in the situation. There's at least two ways to combine these things. One is before the fact, through a particular moment in time with one angle of view, and the other is after the fact, combining multiple moments and possibly multiple angles of view, right? Two options. And here, I'm just recombining this very quickly to explore ideas. What if I had two clouds, one nested inside the other? What if I had a cloud halfway moving across? I wasn't thinking about that when I opened up this file, but suddenly I have a new idea. How many ways can I hide the moon? Notice I'm taking this specific sketch and not thinking of it in terms of I'm going out to execute this specific composition, but I'm looking for broader principles. I'm abstracting it. How many ways can I hide the moon? Rather than getting fixed on this one particular result. When you're in process, I think it helps to stay up at a larger overview, a higher level, rather than getting down and getting stuck on the specifics. And that's one of the things I think with photography, it tends to get you dealing with the particular and to finish results very quickly, sometimes too quickly. Right? So I'm talking about how all of the other things that can go along, all the thought development, all the exploring of your feelings and what you're bringing to the game can do if you spend a little time beforehand exploring in other ways. Certainly, behind the lens is one wonderful way of exploring, but there are others. And what I'm asking us all to do is be a little more versatile, be a little more well-rounded, try some other things, because when you try something different, you get a new perspective. And that's one definition of creativity, finding a new perspective, shifting your perspective. It's interesting. I've read a lot of books on creativity, trying to figure this out and describe it to a number of people. And there are a lot of definitions about what it means to be creative. At one point, I taught a workshop, and I listed everything, every operation that all the students did while I was watching them in the field. And I realized that for every statement that you made, to make a stronger image, get lower and shoot a more dynamic angle, you could also say the opposite. Get higher, right? It's almost as if you weren't dealing with either ors, but a spectrum of possibilities, all of the options in between these poles. And that you could do things that were straight, you could do things that were composited, or any number of other poles, but there was a spectrum of possibilities, how straight or how altered. I remember talking to John Sexton years ago. We were doing our conversation, which you can read up on my website. And I said, okay, you ready for this, John? I said, yeah. I said, you know, it's funny I'm talking to you today because I made a straight photograph today. He said, did you crop it? I said, yeah. Well, then it's not a straight photograph. It was very funny. And, you know, it's debatable whether Ansel's stuff is straight because there's so much dodging and burning. There's a substantial transformation of the original. And you see over time. If you ever get a chance to see Ansel's Moonrise over Hernandez printed in 4 different decades, 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, and the transformation it goes through, it's just a marvelous study in what's possible and how much one's artistic sensibility and one's craft evolves over time. It's really wonderful to see that change in sensibility. And you may track that kind of change in your own work as well, but you won't if you don't be aware of your process. You may also want to just make some brief notes in a place you know where to get them. An artist's journal, for instance. I'm not advocating you go out and buy that big leather-bound book and that precious pen and wake yourself up at 5:30 in the morning and write, today I don't feel inspired, just like yesterday I don't feel inspired. Like, it's just too much data. I have like 20 different kinds of journals. I have a whole, basically it's just a list of all of the artists who have influenced me on a timeline. And I watch how the influence of Alexander Calder when I was a small boy has rippled and is still influencing me today. Or when I first encountered Gursky's work, or actually Gursky's not a good example, Bertinsky's work is actually going to influence me in an interesting way. When was that? And is there any correlation to the way that I'm thinking about the images? And how long does it take for that to ripple out into my own work? I have a clip file of other images that inspire me. I've been writing a whole series of blog posts, which you again can find on my website, about the artists who influence me. And it's been very interesting to pull those together and find the images that really do it for me and try and state simply why this artist is important to me. Sometimes it's very personal. But almost always it's very insightful. And if you just take a little bit of time to follow up, not only will it be a lot of fun, it'll be very enriching. And the richer you make yourself, the richer your work gets. So all of this can be very useful. So I find that there are a number of operations when I'm combining those sketches that I do over and over again, particularly with respect to position in the frame. You know, there's the center, there's left, there's right, there's close to the border. Is it high, is it low? You know, there's a lot of positions to move things around, and sometimes a change in position from low to high makes a big difference in the meaning even, not just the composition, but the meaning of the image that you're creating. Number, the proportion of the frame, and I'm going to talk about that in Game Changers, how I'll alter the proportion of the frame after the fact, not just through cropping. There are other ways, and how important that can be to changing the ways that people view your images, the ways that people look. Basically, images are records of ways of looking, and they guide other people to re-experiencing those ways of looking. And the more interesting you can make that game of looking, the more rich, the more things you can deliver along the way, the more interesting your work becomes to others. And of course, that content needs to come from somewhere as well. So these are 7 different elements that I'll do. It could be substituting an element, like let's change a moon into a sun, what if you transpose something? But it could be something as simple as how much do you show it? Is it fully visible? Is it hidden? Is it partially hidden? Those kinds of things. And being clear about this, when I first sketch, I naturally fall into certain patterns that I'm used to. It just sort of either things bump together and seem to fall into place, or I'm used to certain kinds of things. And there are other operations that I don't naturally think of, and I may need to push myself to explore other possibilities, or even ask the question, what else could I do to find new compositions? And to practice that a little more, because if we just follow our habits, we don't develop new habits, and we may not find those new answers, that new perspective, which so often leads to breakthroughs. So you can see these images basically are looking at different variations on a similar theme. All of these, again, are found compositions or editorial, not composited. I realize I'm looking at a specific pattern, small peaks in a large celestial environment under changing conditions. How many different ways can I show that? Arno Minkkinen absolutely cracked me up with an introduction to one of his slideshows. Terrific black and white photographer who does nude self-portraits, and he starts out, I don't do yoga, I'm not a contortionist. There were a couple of other disclaimers, and I've been making the same photograph all my life. Now, if you look at his compositions, they're extraordinarily varied. But it's interesting, I think what he was saying is that his work has a common theme, an enduring preoccupation, that he's really chasing something. I actually will storyboard some things. I think every picture tells a story, but you can also tell stories with multiple pictures. Now, this is something that editorial photographers, particularly working in journalistic applications, often for a publication, use quite a lot. Fine artists don't tend to emphasize as much, but they can certainly benefit from it. I know I certainly have. It's another way of looking at it. I often come up with a storyboard. There are 7 classic shots. There's a PDF on my website that details all of those 7 classic shots, from the establishing shot to the identifying the main character, having a shot of that peak action, the thing that Cartier-Bresson emphasized so much, that decisive moment, which implies all the moments before and all the moments after, to the outcome, and maybe a curtain call, an opener and a closer. Those 7 shots can tell a story, and it gives you a framework to work within. So let's say you're telling the story of somebody. If you just come in and do a series of 12 portraits, will that tell as much as maybe showing an introduction to where they live, showing them in their environment before you close in to the face and maybe some other aspects? David Duchemin has an interesting chapter in his book, Within the Frame, which is excellent on this, and he details the life of a Buddhist monk. And the detail shot is the hands holding the mala beads after he's established the whole situation of monastery and portrait, then into the hands. And it gives you a kind of a roundness and three-dimensionality to the story and what you're trying to say with that. Think of all of those 7 shots as options, not that you need to get 7 shots. Particularly in magazines these days, it's rare that they're going to run all 7 shots. There's often a lot more pressure put on specific images. Maybe you get 1 or 2. Can you tell a story with just 1? Well, that decisive moment that Cartier-Bresson talks about so much can be that 1 shot, because it implies everything before and what will come after. It is often the 1 shot, the picture that you can tell the story with just 1 picture. It's also the kind of thing that neoclassical painters would often emphasize. You know, that big portrait of Napoleon on his charger over the battle at Waterloo, right? His sword is upraised, the horse is rearing, it's peak action, but it's not when the battle has been won, it's when the tide is about to turn, right? Again, that turning point. It's quite interesting. So I don't get the specific compositions that I put down, but it has helped me explore that there would be many ways of getting human interest into a landscape. More importantly, it gets me asking the question, how many ways can I get human interest into the landscape? I sometimes draw over my images after they're finished. And a lot of times when we're making paintings, we would have to do a lot of studies to figure out what we're going to commit to. Because once you get the thing started, it's hard to reshape the canvas. You have to scrape things down, and things start getting real messy. But those basic compositional structures are often explored before you go, and they can be found after as well. And if I look at this, okay, 3 straight lines, and this, 3 straight lines, and this, 3 straight lines. If I just looked at the images separately, I might not have seen the defining characteristics, or that I'm obsessed with straight lines, right? But it's there, and once I've found the pattern, I realize I'm either in a groove or a rut, that this is an obsession or a preoccupation or a passion that I need to move more deeply into, find out more about, try and deepen, try and do it a little bit better. How many significant variations can I deal with it? In this case, I'd be looking at these images and saying you need to be a little less central, maybe not quite so straight up and down, get a little more dynamism in it. That would just be one observation. Finding patterns within your work is part of that creative process, and it's part of pulling together a body of work and a defining sensibility, a style. This is the thing that can guide you to themes. You ask yourself how you're using those devices that keep coming up again and again and again. So actually drawing on it, on the images, can be very useful. And just as an example, this is not really an example of a drawing, but what I would recommend somebody go through when they do air drawing. How many of you guys play air guitar or something else, or do air opera in the shower, or right? I'm recommending that you be a little Italian. Don't be WASP and draw with a little finger with the elbow against your chest here. I need you to be Italian like this, to draw the big compositional structures like this. It'll help you key into something that Jay Maisel emphasizes so much, gesture. And if you do a little physical research, if you actually do this instead of say, yeah, I kind of get it. If you actually do this, you connect with it more, you feel it more. And very often when people take this strange kinetic exercise, they make stronger images. The gesture is more strongly felt by them, and so it's more strongly felt in the images that they make. So you might look a little weird. Who cares? Make a good picture. It'd be a little more Italian. All right. Air drawing. My question is, how many ways can we leverage all of these other intelligences? We often talk about IQ, but more recently people have been talking about other types of intelligence. There might be an emotional intelligence. There might be the kind of physical intelligence that a sports person or a ballet dancer might have. There are different ways of understanding the world. Now, how can we get those intelligences into our process, into the background, and then into kind of the foundation of the images that we make? This kind of research creates a kind of fertile soil from which this stuff grows. And it's very easy to look at the finished product and overlook all of the things that it took to get there. Yeah, I can say I made that image in 15 minutes. But really, did I just pick up the camera and 15 minutes later I made that great image? Or did it take a lifetime of looking and a lot of practice and some thinking and some feeling? Right? So. One book that I would recommend is Johannes Itten's Elements of Color, if you want to follow up on some of this stuff. And if you want to become a better colorist, I recommend that you do exercises like this.
Spell check on your word exercise.
Yes, we do need the spell check on that. Listen to how I phrase this question. When you look at those two colors, do the two purple squares in the center appear to be identical? Do they look identical to you? Your perception of them is a little different, right? Many of you know already that's because of simultaneous contrast, the way that our eyes look, that in fact they are the same purple, but because of what they're surrounded by, our experience of them differs. You can learn how other colors affect one another and fine-tune them with greater precision and subtlety if you learn the dynamics. And if you simply become more sensitive to them, you can start to explore how you might make these two appear the same. I.e., if I surrounded these neutral colors by very saturated colors, they would no longer appear neutral. And you might edit your files in Photoshop and make them numerically the same, but they wouldn't look the same. The Greek architects knew that their viewers would be standing below the temples that were very high, and that linear perspective would pinch this temple in, so they flared the temples slightly out, so they appeared optically straighter. They compensated for our perception. And I'm recommending that you develop a sensitivity to many things, composition, in this case color. The big classic out there is Joseph Albers' theory and interaction of color, somebody that Jay studied with, and I studied from his pupils. I prefer actually Johannes Itten's book, which I think is a little more precise and a little clearer. And it's curious, they say do it with pieces of paper, I say do it with Photoshop. Just don't run it by the numbers. This is a very interesting exercise where we try and choose a color in the center that feels like it's transparent. And you want it to get that optical illusion where if you flip your perception, it could seem like the orange was on top or the red was on top, that it's right in between. We've done this numerically with Photoshop with dozens of my workshops. And 8 times out of 10, the colors that are chosen optically rather than mixed numerically in Photoshop look more convincing. All right? More importantly, in doing these things, these exercises, you'll develop a more sensitive eye. Now, would you ever have thought that just playing with simple blocks of color would help you see the color in images that you create later more precisely? But that's exactly what it did for me. I remember doing a couple of weeks of these exercises in a curriculum. We'd meet, for an hour a week. And after a few weeks, I remember walking out of the building and suddenly seeing the rich colors that were in the shadows. The shadows on the side of this kind of orange building had a purple quality to them. It wasn't just this flat gray. And suddenly this whole world of color opened up to me because my perception had become more fine-tuned. I also remember, it's interesting, I recommend that you test all of these things and rely on your own experience. I was taught as a painter principles of atmospheric perspective. As colors get further away, they get cooler. So when I was in Antarctica, I couldn't figure out why as white got further away, it kept getting more and more golden. It was the next year that I got to go to White Sands, a place that I visited as a kid who grew up in New Mexico many times. And I was seeing the same effect in the storm clouds off on the horizon, that white got yellower, not bluer, as the atmosphere built up. But I had never seen it that way. I had looked at it, but I'd never really seen it, right? Because I've been taught to think of it another way. This awareness, this constantly pushing to discover more, will liberate you from other people's preconceptions and get you to be clearer about your own direct experience. So I find it tremendously rewarding and tremendously stimulating. I'll actually blur and pixelate my images to look at the color dynamics within specific images. I remember it was fascinating for me to look at how I'd balanced out this more lemon yellow color intuitively, and later saw that I'd made it relate more to these colors so that it was a smoother transition and let people's eyes glide through these other transitions rather than getting stuck on a bright yellow spot that stuck out from the rest of the composition. Now you may want to use color accent to fix the attention on a specific area, like this little pink cloud in the middle of a yellow sky. It's not that one should always have gradation and smoothness, or one should always have accent. It's called what happens when. The question is what happens when. You get a different visual dynamic, and the more you ask these questions, the more you tend to understand it. One of the things that I think is very useful to ask all of us, ourselves, is what's your palette? If I say Ansel Adams, is anybody thinking saturated color? If I say David LaChapelle, is anybody thinking neutral black and white? right? Or Joyce Tennyson. Are you thinking either one? If you know her work, she deals in subtle pastels and sometimes these monochrome, kind of warm-toned portraits. It's a very softer, subtler quality to the image. And again, the color code imparts a different kind of quality. Ansel is bright and contrasting, kind of crystal and clear. Right? David LaChapelle is noisy, almost cartoony in some ways, and there's a certain humor in his work. The color is placed in the service of something. Now that doesn't mean that we can't work in both black and white and color, but it is very hard to present an image like this side by side with an image like this and have them feel like they're made by the same artist with a similar sensibility. Generally, I recommend you group things in sets that relate to one another, or that you create a set of transitions that might help you get there. If we started from here and went to here, finally to here, now do you see how we're getting a gradual desaturation because these two start to relate to one another? So the way you present your images, how you present them in sequence and in context with one another, can help focus the viewer's attention on certain things. And a kind of disregard for how things fit together can often create a mixed message, which is something I often have to work with people who present my work. And so let's just show the greatest hits or the ones that are most eye-catching, but there isn't something that knits them together, and you start looking in too many directions in too many ways, and it becomes confusing. You can control all of these things. You have a lot of options, but be careful about how and when you use the options. Use them in a consistent way. Let's stop on this. I guess the frustrated painter in me is still coming out when I use the iPhone. And I've got a lot of questions about this funny little device, which is always with me. I totally agree with Jay Mazel's corollary to Wayne Gretzky's. Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Jay Mazel, you can't take a picture if you don't have a camera. You know, absolutely. So you got to be careful when you go to dinner with Jay, because you know he's going to be taking your picture. He's got that camera on his shoulder everywhere he goes because he shoots everything. Right? And he's always on and always looking. For me, I'm a little more focused, but I love the spontaneity that this allows me, and I start photographing things that I wouldn't normally photograph, and I start photographing them in ways that I wouldn't normally photograph. And it gets me thinking more versatily. I'm being more visual more consistently, and I'm being a little more considered about it. It's also an opportunity to walk across a campus field and enjoy a magnolia a little bit more, or to find a moment at Point Lobos, or make images in South Africa in the Mandalay Quarter. What's interesting for me is asking questions like, how do I present these images? Where do I present these images? Because I don't present them as my finished images. They're much more a part of my sketchbook. And that may be part of the impulse to making it look more painterly, as well as wanting to look more broadly and not be so focused on minute details. To explore a different way of seeing, I also want to differentiate them from what I consider the finished work. And I think it takes more than just physical polish to finish the work. I think it also has to do with finishing an idea or a theme or a set of concerns, of really kind of knitting them together in an interesting way and presenting them in a way that's coherent. And when you take on projects like this book, it's one of the reasons that I love doing blurb books. You have to think about which images do you include and which do you exclude. What text would you put together with them? How would you sequence the images? Does the set of images have a story arc? How does it move from one to the other? How does it grow? Asking these questions helps me understand the work better, helps me understand what I need to do next to make it stronger or better, or when it's not quite ready and what more I need to do. But also just having the container of a book form, and it could be many different containers. It could be a web slideshow, it could be any number of things, but having a container, some utility to put the images to use, I know how many of you have hard drives with scads of images just waiting to see the light of day, right? I know I do, right? Actually making something, be it prints or an exhibition or an ebook or a physical book that can be made, just one copy can be printed of this kind of thing. Taking on a project can help not only clarify what you've done and consolidate and make it something you can share with other people, but helps you more clearly consider what you're doing, understand where you're going, and also drives more productivity. I found that in taking on a book instead of an exhibition, I had to be more productive. To do an exhibition, I needed maybe 13 images. Let's say I'm going to do 18 to 20 and show half of them that I think are the best. To do the book, I needed 20 to 40. I needed more images. And because there was that container, some place to put it and some use to put those images to, I ended up producing more images. Last year was my most productive year. I'm not a stock photographer like my good friend Seth Resnick, who delivers thousands of images to Getty's website. Only a small percentage of them ever used or even seen. I'm a fine art photographer who generates images that I want to be showing again and again in different contexts for a lifetime, but I produce maybe, last year was over 120 images. That's, 10 a month, which is quite a lot. I remember Ansel saying, in answer to, I think Imogen Cunningham was there as well. So, Mr. Adams, how many good images do you get in a year? He says, well, if I'm lucky, maybe one a month, about 12 a year. And Imogen's going, hell, one in a lifetime. Well, there's a different level of discrimination there. Maybe he only got one moonrise, right? But I think they were being a lot more discriminating about what they felt was really good, but they still celebrated the getting there and all of the other contact sheets they would share with each other. And here in this, I'm just suggesting, think about your artistic process as something that's yours. What's your game? What are your rules? What are your objectives, more importantly? And what practices do you do to advance it, to make it more your own? And realize that it's a dynamic process, that you can be influenced by other people. There's a lot of food for thought out there. Engage it. Again, simply being aware of the process will lead to a greater appreciation, a greater sensitivity, a greater depth, more options to a lot of things. So, watch your process. There's a lot more on this in the book. You can actually preview the entire book online. If you don't want to have the physical thing printed out or pay I think these print-on-demand books can get a little pricey, $60 to have the book, then you can actually just flip through it online. Because really my primary goal here is to share the work, share the ideas. All right? Any questions on that before I move on? Anybody? Did I put you all asleep, or you're waiting with bated breath, or?
When you're out in the field, how do you calm your mind from your own self-noise to allow the environment to affect you?
Yeah. Meditation. I've been meditating since I was in high school. There are actually a whole series of meditation posts that I've been putting up on my website because I realized it's been helpful. It is very challenging to find that calmer, stiller place, and it's something that I've heard a lot of people. Minor White was a classic example of that. He constantly wanted to be more transparent so he could let more of the world in, right? And that does take calming down, thinking fewer thoughts, maybe moving a little slower so you can really take it in, really absorb it, find something new, something that might not be in our fast, well-defined box. There are a lot of meditational techniques. It's not just Buddhism. In fact, all major religions have forms of it, and there are a lot of different practices within it. And so I've got a whole reading list on meditation. Meditation can be as varied as ritualistic dancing, which is very energetic and active, to slow-moving yoga, to really just looking at one thing. There's one Zen technique of looking at something, imagine your favorite flower, and looking at it very intensely for 5, 10, maybe even 20 minutes. Can you imagine like spending 20 minutes doing nothing but really absorbing something you love, right? And learning to screen that out. The mind can be trained, and so it takes practice. And a lot of times people will start it and get frustrated because they can't still the wild horses or that monkey mind. It's challenging. But there are a lot of resources out there that will help, and if you just simply get started, I think it means. So meditation is one way. The other part is just to focus. Well, actually, you could think of this as meditation, but the other way of thinking of it is just stimulate one aspect of yourself intensely and focus a lot on that. Like, so if you're going to walk in a dune field, maybe walk just a little bit faster and pay a lot of attention to the environment. Feel how your body is moving through that environment, how you're physically being affected as you moved through that. And don't let yourself think about your bank account or those calls you need to make or the email. Be there. That actually is a form of meditation. Right? So stimulating one thing and focusing can be very helpful. So, game changers. What I want to suggest here, and let me double check. David, how much time do we have?
Got an hour.
We have another hour?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Good, so we're on time. The key that I want to emphasize here in this session is that so we have this new tool and all of these possibilities. And you know that you can sharpen your images, or you might be able to do HDR, or well, actually HDR is a good example. To do HDR, you have to think about the technique. It's almost like you have to pre-visualize, but you have to be aware of the technique so that you can get the shots. Right? When I joke, this just isn't your father's photography. You guys all get the joke because my father is also a photographer, but also generationally. In many ways, we're all using 21st century tools. How many of you guys are actually still shooting film and being in the chemical darkroom exclusively? Okay, one or two. I'm glad you came too and are keeping an open mind today, right? So many of us are playing a 20th century game while we're using 21st century tools, right? And we've got this whole set of ideas about what we, quote, should and shouldn't do to photographs. A lot of times those notions are based for certain contexts, like journalism, or based on the evolution of the medium. And we've been led to a lot of assumptions which I would ask you to reconsider. I remember being invited by the Project America 24/7 to participate in this kind of Day in the Life of America project, where 40 photographers, or was it 50? 50 photographers in 50 states would document America for, I think it was a week, something like that, right? So when they called me or emailed me, actually it was all digital. I think I talked to one person during the project, and everything else was through an online service or emails. And this was the first all digital project, right? The other Day in the Life ofs had been analog, and this was all digital. I think Olympus was a sponsor, and part of it was everybody got a little Olympus camera, right? So when they emailed me, I said, "Are you sure you have the right guy? I mean, you know what I do, right?" I said, "Yeah, and we also know that maybe 25% of your work is straight up, and if you're willing to work in that way, we'd love to have you be a part of the project." I said, "Okay, now I know who on your team sent you, because there's only one guy on your team who really knows that. And this would be a great experiment, kind of get out of my comfort zone, do something else." I said, "Okay, so what's acceptable practice? This is an all-digital project. Can I do a panoramic stitch, or do a little HDR, or oh no, you can't do anything that you couldn't do in the traditional darkroom." He says, "So why is it an all-digital project?" Right? And there are a lot of times where in journalistic environments, we're limiting journalist practices to what you could do in the traditional darkroom when they're not using those tools, and not letting them do things that would help them represent the scene better. HDR represents more information and doesn't have to look heavily contoured or like you walked into a candy shop with saturation. It can be done well. Many of the images you saw today actually use HDR techniques, and you probably didn't notice it. There's a lot of other people out there who are just sort of pulling the punch and not making the technique something that beats you over the head. I know there's a lot of debate about HDR, but if you think about it, HDR is something that photographers have been chasing since the beginning of photography. The Hill brothers, 5 years after the invention of photography, dealing with paper negatives. They can't get the beach scene and the scene, the sky, so they take two paper negs, one for the sky and one for the scene, and they piece them together to get the scene to look closer to the way they see it. It's about representation. Totally different than Ragelander, who's putting together something to make it look like a Raphael painting. right? Same practice, different application. So we really need to be talking about the applications, and we need to be talking about the disclosures we make to viewers when they look at images. The no credit or no disclosure when you're looking at a photograph in most media outlets leads to a lot of assumptions about, well, that's the way things really were, that's objective and that's factual, when really it's one person's point of view at one moment in time from a very specific angle of view, often with a viewpoint no matter how objective they're trying to be. I appreciate that they're trying to be balanced, but leading us to the assumption that it's somehow truth, factual. We got to realize we're people. People are involved in this. We need to know who they are. I think one of the best things that CNN did was these profiles that they would do on their reporters, like this hour-long special they did on Krishna Amanpour. Like, who is the lady who's behind all of these great stories? And you get a better sense of how to look at her stories now that you know who she is. Right? On the other hand, photo illustration. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean it's been retouched and Christy Brinkley's 12th rib has been removed, or RuPaul's legs aren't really that long, or is this a crazy photo composite, like something that looks like a David LaChapelle or a Jerry Ullsman, or how has it been enhanced, right? It's not enough information. It's too much limitation on the journalists, not enough disclosure for us, way too many assumptions along the way. You're making your photographs for your use, for your website, for your book, for your exhibit, for your uses. You can do anything you want to do. Remember, there is no such thing as cheating in the creative process. Whose game are you playing? When you're playing your own game, the limitations, the rules, the limitations that you place on yourself create the box. We want to know what your box is so we can figure out why you're doing what you're doing, what you're trying to say. We don't really care that Maggie Taylor is doing surreal composites, or she should be doing straight photography. Nonsense. She's doing wonderful work, but she's doing it differently. She's doing it for a reason. Now, what are those reasons? That's when things get interesting, because we're doing things for a reason, right? So again, I'm encouraging you to A, give yourself permission, and B, follow up. Why? Why are you doing the things that you're doing? Because it can lead to greater clarity, greater depth. This is really just a session on possibilities. And one of the things that I'm most excited about with the evolution of technology is how much it challenges me to see in many more ways, to see differently. I constantly find that one of the limitations I run into is my habitual patterns of thinking. I've been trained to think in certain ways. I've developed habits of making pictures in certain ways. And if I reconsider those, particularly just before I click the shutter, I often have a higher success rate because I've got more options before me. Figuring this stuff out later just means you often need to go back out in the field or back on site and try it all over again with the new information today. And that's good too. But it's really helpful to kind of learn from this process and then go back out and reapply it with a specific intention. So it's akin to pre-visualization in many ways. In this session, I was identifying a whole set of possibilities, and I'm going to talk to you maybe about half of these. A couple of the things I'll just touch on, the high ISOs of these new cameras, and whether it's Canon or Nikon or any of them. I remember Joe McNally when the first really fabulous Nikons came out with ISO 64,000, he would go on about. And he was starting to shoot his dancers and other people on site in lighting situations that he'd have to bring the light on site, and he's a master of lighting as well for that reason. But now he was able to shoot much more freely and flexibly because the camera was that much more sensitive. High ISO has opened up this range of light that is really truly extraordinary. I remember I've seen many situations where we've been out on a landscape shoot and the sun has gone down and it's gotten to be dark and a dusk. We can kind of see our way around through the parking lot or what have you. But people are taking their images still on tripods and starting to see more on their LCD than they can see with their naked eye. And it's like, that's really interesting. So wait, the camera represents the way I saw it. Really? its one eye is very different than your two, and its possibilities today are astonishing. One other aspect are these super high resolution images. 5-6 years ago, probably 5 years ago, the Adobe Lab guys made a presentation at Photoshop World where they'd taken the first Canon 1DS, up at the top of the Prudential building in Boston and done this 100+ shot stitch of this new software that made this super resolution file that they could then pan and zoom into. And they zoomed in out across the skyline to this little crane, saw the name of the manufacturer of the wiper blades for the windshield of the crane on, in the picture. And then they moved over to the next building and found out that the person on the 3rd floor was having grapefruit for breakfast. Now, the person who made that shot never saw either one of those things. They found it later in the image that was made. And so this whole notion of representation, the journalist is the eyewitness that goes out and says, yes, this represents the way that I saw it faithfully. And I'm trying to be objective or balanced in my representation, not to distort. Now we're seeing things after dark or at super high resolution in ways that we can't see with our eyes. In fact, I think we're all becoming a lot more cybernetic, right? These are extensions of our perception, much like using a telescope or a microscope or X-rays. We're extending our ability to see through the technology. And that's where I think things get really exciting. And the debates are fantastic, particularly if you get a guy like David Brommer, maybe some Psaki. It just gets interesting, animated at the very least. Right? This gets me to think about, well, what the image is representing, or how I work with time and light, some of the basic building blocks of photography. Right? Remember years ago, Keith Carter, during one of his presentations, said, the basic building blocks of photography are time, light, and memory. I said, time, yep, light, yep, memory. That's interesting, Keith. But the more I get back to it, the more I'm thinking, and that's a very interesting observation about, does it represent the way we saw it? How do we share images with each other and create these kind of surrogate memories? The web is almost like an extension. We're all sharing our memories, this surrogate memory. And I no longer have to remember how to multiply 64 times 34. I can just look it up on the web. Or how many conversations have you had at the dinner table where somebody said, well, just Google that? It's a different way of relating to what's going on up here and subsequently here. So interesting times to be around. My goodness. Yeah, I'm going to tell the story because we're only so many blocks away. When I was going to Yale, Elliot Porter had heart surgery here in town. Elliot lived right down the street in New Mexico. Mom had done so many of his books. It was actually when Mom oversaw the production of his book, Intimate Landscapes, that I saw Cytex machines, which were the digital retouching machines of the days back in the 70s. Mom called them $1 million coloring books, and the minute I saw them, I wanted one. But I had no idea how I would get $1 million. I got Photoshop, and it's doing more. It was really like a dream come true, and it's what pulled me back into photography, because photography just wasn't able to go as far as I wanted it to, and now it's going farther and really pushing me. So Elliot was up here, and he was an extremely active man. Almost 80, he'd gone down to Antarctica one year. He used to walk 5 miles a day. On his first trip, he was getting off the boat onto an iceberg, and the freak wave dropped the boat out from under him. He fractured his collarbone. He fell into the water, got hypothermia. They shipped him down to McMurdo and then back home. And he was so angry that he couldn't finish the trip. He was so curious about everything. So what does he do? He walks his 5 miles a day, and he goes right back the next year. So that's the kind of vital person Elliot was. He was just such an inspiration to me about so many things, but just what it can be like to be a vital person. So here he is, cooped up. He must have been like 8 days after the surgery or something, and you can imagine Elliot's going out of his head, sitting in bed all day long. So I'm just going to pay my respects, 15 minutes. The nurse says, 15 minutes, and Elliot says, don't you dare leave. And we had this hour-and-a-half long conversation. When I was a boy in Winnetka, Illinois, there were 4 Model Ts, and they used to light the street lamps because they were gas. And at the end of the conversation, World War II, nuclear winter was on our minds. Men on the moon, genetic engineering, personal computers. I looked at him and I said, Elliot, to see that much change in one life is absolutely extraordinary. Your generation is extraordinary. And he looked at me straight in the eye and he said, you'll see more. And that was really uneasy because this time Jonathan Schell's Fate of the Earth was on the bestseller list. Carl Sagan was going on about nuclear winter, all the rest of it. Like, I don't want to see that Third World War. And we haven't, you know. But I'm kind of convinced he's absolutely right. You know, the web, personal computing, iPhones, the nature of photography. We're on the cusp of taking our own genetic destiny into our hands. Are we ready for that? Right? Bill Atkinson, one of the big color scientist guys, is working in a think tank where they're developing an artificial neocortex. We had this 4-hour conversation going down to Ushuaia, Argentina. Like, do you realize what this means? There's no skull cap. That means there's no limit to how big it'll be. 20 years from now, we're no longer going to be the smartest thing on the planet. It's like, wow. Just hang on to your seats. Like, the last 20 years
I don't
is...
think we will.
Huh?
I don't think we will.
Well...
I'm sorry.
Well, you know, yes, I understand where you're going with that, and that's that's a supportable argument from one perspective. At any rate, hang on to your seat. The next 20 years is amazing, and I think one of the things that's really important. I read something that made a lot of sense to me 10 years ago. It's not how much you know. It's not even who you know. It's how fast you learn. So to learn fast, you have to have an open mind. Right? Be endlessly curious. Be flexible, not fixed, to take advantage of these new possibilities. And just with that mindset, that open mindset of learning more, finding out what the possibilities are. Doesn't mean you have to do them, but being aware of them is very helpful. Right? That also means there's so much to do that I don't think you can master it all. I think you have to make some choices. And what's most important to you? What's most useful for you to learn now? There's so much to learn. It's really quite amazing. So if I were to boil all those down into just a few strategies, it would be enhance. So we can enhance the color in the image. We've got a curve that's separate from chemistry and paper. Not Ansell's curve, but the flexible Photoshop curve. He'd go nuts over it, guarantee you. Extending and contracting. Let's think about it like a panoramic merge. I know in photography, so many times we're taught and we need to learn how to use the frame to make the image. But we also need to be able to think outside the frame. The frame often becomes this theater that we can stage a drama or a story on, and it becomes a very useful 4 lines. Right? But we can often be a little bit, well, we can have a little tunnel vision and not see what's outside, or that we could make images with multiple shots to tell a stronger story. Simply by changing our perspective. It's as simple as click, click. It's this little shift. It's so simple, but not obvious and challenging perceptually. Sometimes the simplest things are the most profound. So I'm going to show you some advanced things in Photoshop, but I'm also going to show you some very simple things that can have a profound effect on your images. And again, difficult doesn't necessarily mean better. Harder doesn't equal better. We'll get to that. Distort or undistort. How many of you guys are using lens profiles in Photoshop or in Lightroom to correct lens, distortions, chromatic aberration, wide-angle distortion? The rest of you guys not using them? Okay, it's a real treat. I mean, there's some really fantastic possibilities here. But then again, we could also distort things. What would Jay Maisel do with Puppet Warp if he knew how to use Photoshop? You know, he's all about gesture. What if he could make that gesture even more? Right? Jay doesn't do that. He lets his assistants do it, so he's not thinking that way, and that's fine. But like, there's a new possibility. I'm certainly thinking that way. It's quite interesting. Right? It does different things to my head, and I start making pictures. I start making different pictures, new pictures, more pictures. And also adding and removing. So of course, compositing, everybody thinks a lot about adding something in. So you remember we're here and we're in Jay's town. I mean, he's the quintessential New Yorker, right? You guys all know Jay Maisel? Definitely, if you don't, I encourage you to take a look at it. Terrific photographer. So I'm out at the Epson offices, about to do a presentation. Jay just happens to be in town. In the conference rooms, they have different photographers. So there's a Greg Gorman room and there's a Jay Maisel room. Patting him on the back. Looks great, maestro. We get into my room, he starts doing this. I'm like, what are you doing? He said, I got one more than you. that's great. Okay. And so he's smoking his stogie and he starts coming up to me. Are you, I'm not going to say it, he's very New York. Are you with me? I said, Jay, I wouldn't have said it that way, but you're right. I went to the racetrack. I couldn't get to the area where the rocks were sliding around because the racetrack was too wet. You'd leave footprints. You're not supposed to walk on there. So I cloned the cracks out and made my own paths. Yeah, I got one just like that. Only mine's more pure. I drove my car out on the mud flats. Okay. You know, to each their own. There's more to that story, but let's move on. What I wanted to point out is that path was created by taking something out, not by adding something in. So removing things can be just as important as putting things in. Like all those 10,000 tourists in national parks these days. I'll show you a quick solution for having the park to yourself, at least in your images. Right. Let's start out with these lens profiles and how we can take an image from this to this. All right, let's just deal with the lens profiles first and show you what they are and how they work. Relatively simple to apply, thank goodness, and they were designed to do one thing, and then I'll show you how to do another with them. Let me reset all of this. All right, that's where the defaults are. Obviously, I start with the defaults, but give myself permission to go anywhere I need to go. All right. They're designed to take the distortions of a lens out, and they'll do things like straighten our horizon, which can be very helpful, particularly if you're using wide angle. If you're using fisheye, it's extraordinary how much it actually dials out, right? It will do things like take out vignetting. Now, if you like the vignetting, there's nothing stopping you from deciding to take out the distortion and just dial out the vignetting. Maybe you even like the distortion, the wide angle distortion that you might get, bringing the center of the frame closer to you rather than flattening it out. But one of the reasons I would almost always use this is to remove any kind of chromatic aberration that might be in there. You know those colored halos that you see most easily along high contrast lines? This will just take 90% of them out with the click of a button. It picks up the metadata from your file, knows which lens and camera combination you're using, and it has a profile that just automatically dials that out. Most lenses are supported. If your lens is not supported, Adobe Labs has a utility that will allow you to build your own profile. I don't think you're going to need to build it for the standard ones. They've done a very good job with most of them. But there is a whole user community of people who have built profiles for exotic lens camera combinations, and they share those profiles on the web. So you can not only make your own, you can also participate in that community. But for most of us, it's really just a matter of check a box and decide whether you want to dial out distortion or not.
Is this only provided in Camera Raw?
This is in Camera Raw and in Lightroom. Realize that Lightroom and Camera Raw are exactly the same processing engine. All of the features are identical, thank God, right? The interface just looks different, but there is no functionality in the Develop module in Lightroom that's not here in Camera Raw. And that allows you to work in between the two of them very fluidly, very precise, very easily. Yeah.
With the Nikon D800, where they physically take the filter off the camera for a higher price, can you use these profiles to correct the chromatic aberration that occurs when you get the extra sharpness by removing that filter?
It's a good question. I'm sure that if Adobe doesn't support a profile for a D800 where the filter has been removed, that somebody on Adobe Labs has built a profile for that, but it may not be in the default that Adobe is currently shipping. That's an interesting question. And a good example of where maybe the lens camera combination is not that exotic, but it's been slightly modified, and you might want a different profile. Terrific use for this. One of the things that I want you guys to see, though, is do you see how in the distortion of the image, I'm actually losing a little bit of the image, right? It's starting to push information that's on the border out to the border. Take a look at this little black spot or darker spot here. When I check it, it touches the border. So you may lose some stuff. Now that's one thing that you want to be mindful of. You can come into manual and reduce the scale to see the distortion around the frame, right? To make it rectangular, you either have to crop it or you can retouch it. Right? You use content aware fill, or you can use cloning to fill in that area depending on the type of image that you're making. If you're putting it into Time magazine, you're not going to be doing that. Right? If you're making a fine art print, you might. You may or may not, depending on what you're trying to do with your image. Right? So I want you to just be aware that you're losing a little, and that means you may want to shoot it a little loose. Right? Instead of framing tightly with the edge of the frame, I often shoot once tight just to remind myself what the composition is, and then step back or zoom out to get a little bit of extra there to give myself a little elbow room, a little wiggle room to compensate for anything like this. And then the second fallback is go in and clone that information to fill in the rectangular if I'm missing something that's important. There are distortions involved, and you may like the distortions in one area, like straightening out this horizon, and not in another, and that means you could process this twice, a quote corrected version at the top for a straight horizon, and then a bottom that has the spatial relationships from the lens distortion that perhaps you prefer, as I do in this, and you can layer the two together. So you can kind of mix and match the best of both. You don't want to get fancy with that, that's fine. I do recommend that you use this on just about every raw image that you process, at the very least, for taking out the chromatic aberration. And it also has, the newer versions have a very good defringe function that can work for that chromatic aberration around spectral highlights or very bright whites, where you tend to get a lot of it. They've greatly improved that. All useful. Let me just mention very quickly that we haven't touched other tools here, like vertical distortion. Do you see what that's doing to your sense of the recession from the foreground to the background? As I pull the vertical up, it makes it feel like it's further away. It's almost, well, it's more extreme than the difference between a wide angle and a telephoto in terms of the compression and expansion of space. It's one more tool in your tool set in addition to lenses, in addition to point of view or angle of view. Actually, there's a difference between point of view and angle of view. Let's call it angle of view, right? You also have this distortion that will help you enhance this sense of space. So if we're willing to enhance a sense of depth with color, like atmospheric perspective, or contrast, like Ansel would do, use an orange filter to clear out haze, right? What about distortion like this? If we're willing to accept the distortion of a lens, why not accept the subtle, sometimes dramatic, distortion by an artist? Interesting question. I think there is a point at which you can go too far and it no longer seems believable. And if that suspension of disbelief is important in the image, then you may want to pull your punch. I really think the limits of believability or being able to form consensus between viewers. Yeah, it's mostly the one limit that's in front of us now. There are far fewer limitations than ever before. So, how many of you would routinely, while you're processing your file, explore these kinds of options to enhance your image in these new ways? I know that I have to push on myself. It's a new habit, and I've had to play with it a bunch to get this to become second nature. You need to use this a number of times to understand it intuitively or at a more tissue level before you start thinking predictively when you're shooting in any environment, knowing that you can change the spatial relationships in your image. It's not fancy. It's 2 sliders. Yeah, okay, so you could play in with distortion here as well, right? Barrel and pincushion distortion. So let's call it 3 sliders. Not a lot of hard Photoshop stuff, right? But does very interesting things to your head, and that habit isn't going to happen the moment you leave this room. If you're excited about this, I strongly encourage you to play with it for, well, actually they say it takes 21 days to form a new habit. So maybe play with it for 21 days. Do it once a day for 21 days, and maybe it'll become second nature. But it's certainly a fascinating set of options and a whole new way of thinking about a pretty fundamental thing. In representation, how do we represent what's missing? You know, this is flat. So how do we increase the sense of dimension and space? You know, the visual impression. This is one way among a number. And for me, much as I like that image, I prefer the one on the right. Very interesting to think about how it makes me feel like I'm higher up, looking down in. I often think of when you look down in, you see more. And in this case, it's not a change of angle of view that allows me to see something behind the dune, but it does make me feel like I'm seeing into it. So there's a really interesting relationship between angle of view and this distortion of perspective. Pretty interesting. Pretty interesting. Not going to cover it in this session. I've got to put together a whole other session. I'll be writing more in Digital Photo Pro in my column about all of the distortion options in Photoshop. But this is a short list of 6, getting from the very simple lens profiles out to the quite complex liquefy, a whole progression of increasingly sophisticated distortion tools. 3 of which I think you should all be aware of: lens profiles, free transform, and content aware scale, which is where I'm going next. The plasticity, the fluidity of the picture frame, of the photographic image these days is really quite extraordinary. We have this new question: do I crop or do I retouch? And I realized when I got a hold of Photoshop, I needed to start rethinking things. In the past, if there was a telephone line in a landscape, let's say you have a landscape, gorgeous cloud, and a telephone line in between, I would often just take the landscape to get that darn telephone line out of my pictures. But the minute I saw the clone stamp tool, I now started to realize I had to think differently. I had to think again of what can I take out of the picture to make it stronger, to make it more complete. And how far am I willing to go? Because it changes the nature of the photograph, it changes the kind of statement that you're making when you do that kind of thing. Right? In panoramic stitches, you often have this issue as well. This is a panoramic stitch made from a helicopter, right? Okay, gutsy, so I'm doing panoramic stitches from images shot at 1,000th of a second at 3,000 feet. You know, but that was the shot that I wanted, so I tried it, and thank God it worked. Right? So a lot of times you have to do this. Remember, photography itself was an experiment. I had to work this out over a number of years. And then one of the things that makes 19th century photography so interesting is, well, they didn't know what photography was. They were thinking, they've got this new tool, now what can we do with it? What does it do that other things don't? A lot of the dialogue was positioning photography against painting and trying to define itself in opposition. The two have kind of been doing this for a long time, right? 175 years. It's been an interesting dialogue, but there have been other assumptions along the way. Just question those assumptions. So this is the panoramic merge, and let's just say that I've decided to crop to something like this. Do I continue to crop and eliminate that, and then I lose this line coming down to the corner? Or do I come in and retouch? And content-aware scale, please come to the rescue. Now, one of the things about content-aware scale is that it usually succeeds or fails epically. So you'll know instantly if it fails, it will fail epically. And there are some ways to work around that. I've just recorded an action. Sorry, that's an old habit. I'm going to come into here, fill content aware instead of foreground. So that means Photoshop is going to sample information in the surrounding area and come up with the most likely acceptable substitute, doing a lot of pattern recognition. We're going to see a lot of facial pattern recognition in Photoshop and in other programs, including Facebook. I think it just succeeded fairly epically. That just saved me an awful lot of retouching. Now, I might have some repetition like this that I might want to do a little bit of extra manual retouching. Where it's acceptable, it still seems artificial because of that regular repetition, and coming in with the clone stamp tool, I can easily randomize some of it and it no longer seems so obvious, right? So a little bit of tweaking and you can cure some of that. There are other times where when it fails epically, it creates these rhythmic, unnatural patterns, and there it helps a lot to either don't be so greedy and just do simpler areas, or feather it just a few pixels, or even just change the selected area just slightly and it will recompute. It's another one of those weird things where in the computer sciences, doing the same thing twice expecting a different result is not always a definition of insanity. Fantastic tool, will save you hours on retouching. But again, the main thing that I wanted to highlight there was I have more options than before. I can either crop or I can retouch, and I'll get a very different image as a result, right? I have more options. Again, if I shot a little more loosely, it would be easier for me to crop in. So again, think about bracketing, like shooting loose and shooting tight, so that you have your options open. It's funny how bracketing composition challenges anybody who's got a traditional training. It's like, couldn't you made up your mind about the composition ahead of time? You're not a very good photographer. You know, but bracketing exposure, that's okay. It's like, or don't bracket at all. You should be a real photographer and be able to get it the first shot out. You know, master your tools. Come on, just get the shot. Just show me an interesting picture. You know, later we'll talk about how you got there, and I really don't care if you're like the most technical genius in the world. I just want to see a really interesting picture. You know, the only relevance how you got there has, to my understanding of the image, is what you're trying to say with it. You know, when Maggie Taylor decides to composite somebody else's 19th century photographs and colorize them, that's an interesting decision. Now why? Right? That's interesting. The fact that she didn't take her own photograph for a lot of those sources, is that cheating? Is that wrong? Is that, no, it's just different, right? So let yourself do whatever you need to do to get the shot. I'm going to come, yeah, we're on that. I'll do that. So I like the little mountain on the left, and I like the mountain on the right, and I'm on a boat, and I can't zoom back. I don't have a wide enough angle lens to get them both. But I can stitch together in Photoshop and get what I'm looking for, right? Now I'll come back to that. No, I won't. I want to make sure that I get this. Panoramic stitches are not just for long horizontal or long vertical compositions. It can sometimes be used just to get that extra inch to one side or top and bottom, just that little bit of extra. You may have your back against the wall or your toes on a cliff, and you just can't move to get everything you want with the gear that you've got. Take the second shot so that you can get the information that you want and make the stronger image that you see, but that you can't fully capture with one shot. right? If you can see it, you'll know to make the second shot. Again, making this habitual is the challenge. Being on site and not saying, well, this is all I've got. It's not all you've got. You've got a lot of options. How many of you guys routinely do panoramic stitches in Photoshop? For the
aspect ratio being so different, does it change when you're doing it?
You mean to go from here to here, totally different aspect ratio? Yeah, changes a lot. Implied in your question, is there some idea that all images should have the same aspect ratio? Or that all of your images should have the same aspect ratio?
Grouping them for a particular purpose, like a book.
Yeah, if you're grouping them. So now, a book, you can float it on a page with different proportions. The question is, what happens when the aspect ratio changes in your image? And I'll come back to that in just a second because it's a powerful creative tool. But in looking at images with different aspect ratios, one to the other, you're driving a little more attention to the aspect ratio and a little more towards the idea that these have been either cropped or composited to create those different proportions. Right? So it drives more attention to what's changing. And if you don't want to do that, if you want to deflect it, maybe you want to play the photojournalist game, where a lot of photojournalists like to show the film edge, which is gone these days, but they still keep the aspect ratio the same, so they're emphasizing what's inside the frame and less the frame itself. That's totally valid. You're kind of deflecting attention to kind of like, it's the Andy Warhol syndrome. You show the same thing 20 times and you get desensitized, or you kind of discount it. Right? You vary things a lot and you're going to be directing the attention a lot to what changes. It's a choice. Right? So I personally show, as you saw, images that are wildly different proportions, and I take a lot of care with the proportion of my image, and I'll show you more on that in just a sec. Since we're here, I just want to show you how easy panoramic stitches are. It's as simple as coming in here and in Bridge. You can also do this in Photoshop. It's a similar thing in Lightroom. Remind me to come back and tell you if it bugs out. Right now we're just going to go to Photo Merge. There are times when Photo Merge has a little problem. It's a strange bug that sometimes affects some of us and not others. So Adobe's having a hard time fixing it, and there is a manual process for this. Today, just pray with me that it just automatically works. Notice you have multiple ways of blending those together. Photoshop will choose the method that it thinks would be best, but you can actually change the blending option, which will change spatial relationships in your image, and I'll show you an example of that in just a second. You can choose to reduce the vignetting and change any geometric distortion as well. A couple of extra options there. I generally like to go with the vignetting removal, particularly with wider angle shots. And that's one thing, when you're shooting this, make sure you overlap the images. A lot of people shoot their images edge to edge. You need those frames to overlap. Say about a third. If you're going really wide angle, under 35, overlap it by half. A lot of people like to increase their resolution by shooting vertically and doing 6 stitches instead of 2, and you get a higher res file. Right. So normally you can just say okay, and as long as Photoshop is behaving, it will put these 2 into layers. Good, it did the trick. Into 2 layers, and will mask the 2. So notice it's done the distortion, which yes, you could have done manually, but would take a lot of time, and it's made the mask that hides part of the image so that it blends in with the rest of it. Right? And you can see, now we're back to that crop or retouch question. In this case, I've shot loosely enough that I'm able to simply crop rather than do a lot of retouching. You may or may not be that lucky, and we've already talked about that aspect there. Just to show you really quickly, you may want to explore different ways of stitching them together. This is just simply layering the 2 on top of each other without distortion. This is a version similar to what we just did. Notice it came out slightly differently. And if you compare the 2, you'll see that the proportion of one mountain to the other and the way that those knit together is different. So it may pay to explore a few of your options during the merge process. If that photo merge bugs out, go in instead to load those files in Photoshop as layers, load files into layers, and then you can select both layers and in Photoshop select the photo merge. It's a way of tricking Photoshop into working if it fails the first time. When it fails, it'll go through that whole process, and just as it stitches it all together, it'll close the file. It's very frustrating. It happens sometimes, so if you run into that bug, you'll know where it is. Let's talk about another distortion thing as well. This one, again, fairly simple. I'm going to use a number of distortion tools here to explore different possibilities of my image. And, let me skip ahead. Do I have that here? Because I want to follow up on your question really quick. You look at these images really differently. Panoramics tend to guide you across or up and down. The square format tends to be very stable, often emphasizes geometric relationships. Even if you just looked at two subtler versions, they're substantially different. And all I'm doing here is distorting the aspect ratio. If I just double click this, I can use this as my background. You can't distort your background. You could duplicate this as a layer as well. And here I'm going to come under Edit, Transform. I often like to use Free Transform because it wraps all of these options into one, Command T, and then simply scale this in. You could explore multiple options. I often like to come in and duplicate the file to look at a second option side by side. So I'm going to pull these two out. And explore what happens when I make it slightly thinner. Will the real image please stand up? In point of fact, they're a composite, which changes the proportion, the aspect ratio. Anyway, is there any, quote, original set of proportions? And the proportion is established by the format of the camera, right, and the box that you're using. It's not something that's out there. It's something that you decided to pick up based on the tool that you're using. So is it acceptable to distort slightly? It's acceptable to distort through angle of view. It's acceptable to distort by putting a different lens on that camera, but is this unacceptable? Forget the words unacceptable and should. Let's just go back to different. Now let's go towards interesting. You respond to the image quite differently based on the proportion of the frame. Vertical images tend to be a little bit more dynamic. Horizontal images tend to be a little more stable. And they emphasize different ways of guiding the eye through the image. Why not enhance a little? Again, this is not Photoshop wizardry, but I do think it's Photoshop mastery. If you make it second nature and you fine-tune the proportions of your image to make those images as powerful as you possibly can. Right. I've spent the last 20 years blowing people's mind with Photoshop and all the fancy things you can do with Photoshop, to the same kinds of images, doing the same kinds of things, and it gets a little tedious. But when it starts me to think differently, when I start to see the world in new ways, when I start to see new possibilities, then I start to get pretty excited. And I love it when these things are simple but powerful, right? So I'm going from here to here, and this is a different kind of distortion. To get from here to here, notice the change in the shape. And actually, let me just show you dynamically. If we use Edit, Content Aware Scale, and pull this down, notice it is distorting, but the chunk of snow at the bottom isn't distorting nearly as much as the sky. The frame to the top of the mountain has suddenly touched, and the white space in between here on the glacier has become compacted, while the mountain up top has not. Photoshop searches through, finds the low frequency information, or the area that's a lot of smooth texture first, then just broad texture second. It focuses on detail that it thinks is important, and you can mask it so that you identify certain areas to not distort. And then it will then non-uniformly, unlike free transform, non-uniformly distort the thing. And notice what you can do, not only to bringing things closer. Notice by doing this, I eliminate a lot of the dead space in between the top of the mountain and the iceberg at the bottom. I bring the mountain and the iceberg closer, intensifying their relationship to one another, making that stronger. Whenever I see things, two things far apart, that I like the relationship, and I know that relationship would just be lost in this long frame, I often think about take it anyway, because I can bring them together more closely through a little distortion. That could be horizontally, it could be vertically. Right? Then you can also change the proportion of the objects inside your image if you want to go a little further. Right? That's the kind of thing that you can't do with a change of angle and view. Sometimes you can do this kind of thing with a change of angle of view. You might want to combine the two, changing your angle of view for one shot and distorting in a second. A lot of possibilities with just a few simple sliders, all making stronger compositions. I want to highlight two articles that are up on, well, one of them will be up on Digital Photo Pro, this one. The next article that I deliver from my column there, I've been writing there for 5 years plus, is about extending depth of field, focus stacking. Photoshop has gotten a lot better about it. When it first did it, you'd often have some soft artifacts. Just as a caveat, if you really get into a lot of this, people who are doing macro photography, maybe close-up florals, where you've got extreme depth of field, starting to do a lot of this. They started in the medical and forensics, scientific aspects, uses of Photoshop. Now we can do things like, if you haven't got enough depth of field, I'm shooting at my toes and out to the horizon, then you can take two shots, one that's soft on the horizon, one that's soft in the beginning, or rather one that's sharp on the horizon, one that's sharp together, and just simply mask it. A simple gradient mask will do that trick. But for something that's more complicated, like this close still life, where you've got more depth of field or more focus issues as you're stepping through this space, now you can layer that together in Photoshop. It would take me 3-4 minutes, which we don't have to do this, but I want to let you know there's an article coming up in Digital Photo Pro next issue that's on that. The other thing that I wanted to show you, can we go over 3 minutes?
We can go over a few minutes.
Yeah, I'm going to do this one thing and then I'll answer some questions. We'll wrap. So imagine you have things in your frame that you don't want. These are stripped in just for demonstration, but imagine you have 10,000 German tourists. As long as those tourists are moving, you can remove them if you take 2 or more shots. And the key is the birds are here in different places in the frame, right? And I'm going to come in and open those up under Photoshop. We're going to load files into Photoshop as layers. Again, the trick for any panoramic merges that don't quite work out. It's going to load those as layers, but now unlike highlighting all of these and then going and photo merging them, we're going to come under layer and turn this into a smart object. So we're going to put all 3 into one smart object. And then smart objects have a blend mode, or rather they're actually a stack mode, where the blend mode of median will just drop them out. What's going on? Photoshop is looking for the stuff that stays consistent and it preserves it. Because we have 3 shots, right? Let me uncouple that. Because we have 3 shots where the birds are in different places, but we have 2 shots, right, where we have information here, whoops, information in both of those that's the same, it keeps the stuff that's the same, right? So you need 3 shots to automate it. If you don't have 3 shots, but you just have 2, and something has moved, you can do it manually by simply adding a mask and brushing it out. Make sense? So again, if you've got 3 shots, thank goodness you could just put your camera on bracket as long as they're moving fast. Often you have to just stay still. And these techniques of multiple shots are often better done with tripods. The longer amount of time, the more you're going to need a tripod for anything like that. But don't let that stop you from doing handheld HDR. If something's moving fast like this, you could easily do it. You just need to stay still in the background. So here under Layer, we're going to go to Smart Object and convert it. Notice it's got the little icon here where you can see that little page turn saying it is a smart object. And under Smart Objects, again, you have a stack mode. In this case, the median is what's going to drop it out. You can actually get ghost effects with mean, which is kind of interesting. So here we're getting these slight ghosts. So if you want ghost tourists in your park, use the other stack mode, right? But what that's showing is that there are a lot of ways around solving these challenges. And what I was hoping to suggest is that the creative process is a process of discovery, of looking, of exploring and finding things, discovering things. And along your way, testing, you'll find new techniques that will help you think and, more importantly, see. I love that Marcel Proust quote so much, that the real voyage of discovery is not in seeking new lands, but in finding new eyes, right? Of seeing things in different ways. Thank you. Thanks for coming, and pass this forward and go explore these resources.
For more information, please visit us online, give us a call, or stop by our New York City Superstore. You can also connect with us on the web.